I have been so overwhelmed by the many storms that have broken over my head, that I am become passive in the hands of the Almighty, like a sparrow in the talons of an eagle. I live, because it is not ordained for me to die. If succor be sent to me, I will accept it. Ah, madam, said Monte Cristo, you should not talk thus. It is not so we should evince our resignation to the will of heaven, on the contrary, we are all free agents. Alas! Exclaimed Mercedes, if it were so, if I possessed free will, but without the power to render that will efficacious, it would drive me to despair. Monte Cristo dropped his head and shrank from the vehemence of her grief. Will you not even say you will see me again? He asked. On the contrary, we shall meet again, said Mercedes, pointing to heaven with solemnity. I tell you so to prove to you that I still hope. And after pressing her own trembling hand upon that of the Count, Mercedes rushed up the stairs and disappeared. Monte Cristo slowly left the house and turned towards the quay. But Mercedes did not witness his departure, although she was seated at the little window of the room which had been occupied by old Dantes. Her eyes were straining to see the ship which was carrying her son over the vast sea, but still her voice involuntarily murmured softly. Edmund, Edmund, Edmund. Chapter 113. The Past. The Count departed with a sad heart from the house in which he had left Mercedes, probably never to behold her again. Since the death of little Edward a great change had taken place in Monte Cristo. Having reached the summit of his vengeance by a long and tortuous path, he saw an abyss of doubt yawning before him. More than this, the conversation which had just taken place between Mercedes and himself had awakened so many recollections in his heart that he felt it necessary to combat with them. A man of the Count's temperament could not long indulge in that melancholy which can exist in common minds, but which destroys superior ones. He thought he must have made an error in his calculations if he now found cause to blame himself. I cannot have deceived myself, he said, I must look upon the past in a false light. What? He continued, can I have been following a false path? Can the end which I proposed be a mistaken end? Can 1 hour have sufficed to prove to an architect that the work upon which he founded all his hopes was an impossible, if not a sacrilegious, undertaking? I cannot reconcile myself to this idea, it would madden me. The reason why I am now dissatisfied is that I have not a clear appreciation of the past. The past, like the country through which we walk, becomes indistinct as we advance. My position is like that of a person wounded in a dream. He feels the wound, though he cannot recollect when he received it. Come, then, thou regenerate man, thou extravagant prodigal, thou awakened sleeper, thou all-powerful visionary, thou invincible millionaire, once again review thy past life of starvation and wretchedness, revisit the scenes where fate and misfortune conducted, and where despair received thee. Too many diamonds, too much gold and splendor, are now reflected by the mirror in which Monte Cristo seeks to behold Dante's. Hide thy diamonds, bury thy gold, shroud thy splendor, exchange riches for poverty, liberty for a prison, a living body for a corpse. As he thus reasoned, Monte Cristo walked down the Rue de la Caisserie. It was the same through which, 24 years ago, he had been conducted by a silent and nocturnal guard. The houses, today so smiling and animated, were on that night dark, mute, and closed. And yet they were the same, murmured Monte Cristo, only now it is broad daylight instead of night. It is the sun which brightens the place, and makes it appear so cheerful. He proceeded towards the quay by the Rue Saint-Laurent, and advanced to the Consigne. It was the point where he had embarked. A pleasure boat with striped awning was going by. Monte Cristo called the owner, who immediately rode up to him with the eagerness of a boatman hoping for a good fare. The weather was magnificent, and the excursion a treat. The sun, red and flaming, was sinking into the embrace of the welcoming ocean. The sea, smooth as crystal, was now and then disturbed by the leaping of fish, which were pursued by some unseen enemy and sought for safety in another element, while on the extreme verge of the horizon might be seen the fishermen's boats, white and graceful as the seagull, or the merchant vessels bound for Corsica or Spain. But notwithstanding the serene sky, the gracefully formed boats, and the golden light in which the whole scene was bathed, the Count of Monte Cristo, wrapped in his cloak, could think only of this terrible voyage, the details of which were one by one recalled to his memory. The solitary light burning at the Catalans, that first sight of the Chateau d'If, which told him whither they were leading him, the struggle with the gendarmes when he wished to throw himself overboard, his despair when he found himself vanquished, and the sensation when the muzzle of the carbine touched his forehead, all these were brought before him in vivid and frightful reality. Like the streams which the heat of the summer has dried up, and which after the autumnal storms gradually begin oozing drop by drop, so did the Count feel his heart gradually fill with the bitterness which formerly nearly overwhelmed Edmond Dantes. Clear sky, swift flitting boats, and brilliant sunshine disappeared, the heavens were hung with black, and the gigantic structure of the Chateau d'If seemed like the phantom of a mortal enemy. As they reached the shore, the Count instinctively shrunk to the extreme end of the boat, and the owner was obliged to call out, in his sweetest tone of voice, "Sir, we are at the landing." Monte Cristo remembered that on that very spot, on the same rock, he had been violently dragged by the guards, who forced him to ascend the slope at the points of their bayonets. The journey had seemed very long to Dantes, but Monte Cristo found it equally short. Each stroke of the oar seemed to awaken a new throng of ideas, which sprang up with the flying spray of the sea. There had been no prisoners confined in the Chateau d'If since the Revolution of July, it was only inhabited by a guard, kept there for the prevention of smuggling. A concierge waited at the door to exhibit to visitors this monument of curiosity, once a scene of terror. The Count inquired whether any of the ancient jailers were still there, but they had all been pensioned, or had passed on to some other employment. The concierge who attended him had only been there since 1830. He visited his own dungeon. He again beheld the dull light vainly endeavoring to penetrate the narrow opening. His eyes rested upon the spot where had stood his bed, since then removed, and behind the bed the new stones indicated where the breach made by the Abbé Faria had been. Monte Cristo felt his limbs tremble. He seated himself upon a log of wood. "Are there any stories connected with this prison besides the one relating to the poisoning of Mirabeau?" asked the Count, are there any traditions respecting these dismal abodes, in which it is difficult to believe men can ever have imprisoned their fellow creatures? Yes, sir, indeed. The jailer Antoine told me one connected with this very dungeon. Monte Cristo shuddered. Antoine had been his jailer. He had almost forgotten his name and face, but at the mention of the name he recalled his person as he used to see it, the face encircled by a beard, wearing the brown jacket, the bunch of keys, the jingling of which he still seemed to hear. The Count turned around, and fancied he saw him in the corridor, rendered still darker by the torch carried by the concierge. Would you like to hear the story, sir? Yes, relate it, said Monte Cristo, pressing his hand to his heart to still its violent beatings. He felt afraid of hearing his own history. This dungeon, said the concierge, was, it appears, some time ago occupied by a very dangerous prisoner, the more so since he was full of industry. Another person was confined in the chateau at the same time, but he was not wicked, he was only a poor mad priest. Ah, indeed? Mad? Repeated Monte Cristo, and what was his mania? He offered millions to anyone who would set him at liberty. Monte Cristo raised his eyes, but he could not see the heavens, there was a stone veil between him and the firmament.